basically, these are the sorts of things that I've been thinking about for some time. When you're working in schools and you're working in education, you're looking to see what sort of worldviews are the ones that are dominating, and you begin to study it a little bit. And as you do so, well, if you're me, you begin to make connections. And so what you're going to hear now is basically the connections I've been making over the last 25 years or so. Um, I've got more connections to make. It's not end of story, but this is where I am so far. And I've called this first one Reason's Failed Coup d'etat. Reason, as far as I can see, is just the way as human beings we work things out. We use our mind, and we reckon that if we can use our mind accurately, then we can actually begin to control our outlook, our opinions, and therefore control our lives as well. And reason has offered us perhaps this tantalizing chance of being able to do that. And I'm not so sure that it's succeeded. And so that's what this little dit's going to be about. I want to start, though, I want to go back historically. How do we know how people a long time thought? What did they think? What were their thinking patterns? Basically, we can look at pictures on walls and we can look at archaeological digs, but this was an archaeological dig that was quite important. Ugarit is in modern day Syria, quite near Aleppo. And in the 1920s, a farmer was farming, he's plowing his field and his plow hit a stone. So he dug up the stone and found it was a stone flag, and he lifted it up and found himself in a tunnel. And the tunnel was an entrance to the tomb of someone long since dead. And he went into the tomb and found bits and pieces and took them to the local market because he thought he could make a bob or two out of them. And down at the local market, some of the French, it was a French territory, French academics saw it, and they were really piqued by what they saw and excited, because there was knowledge of a place called Ugarit, which was a port in that sort of area, but no one knew where it was. And they hoped that this might be what they were looking for. And thereafter, every year for the next 40 or so years, except the war, they dug. And they did indeed find an awful lot of remains there. And they reckon this is what the city looked like. And basically, it had been started, they reckon, about 2000 BC. And its heyday was in the 14th and 13th centuries BC, when it was a major trading location. And if you look at the map, you can see at the top the Hittite Empire, and you see at the bottom the Egyptian Empire. And they were two very, very powerful blocks of people. And they wanted to trade with each other, but they tended to want to fight each other as well. And Ugarit took advantage of that, and it was the trade point between the two. The reason we know all this is because they found thousands and thousands of these, some of them in good condition like that, some of them in little pieces which they put together. And over the course of a year, they managed to decipher what they were looking at. And basically it's cuneiform, but it's alphabetical cuneiform. So it was one step on from that which had gone before. And they worked out what was going on. And they discovered that they had tablets that were complaining that people hadn't been paid for goods. They had tablets about complaining about the bad treatment of people. They had tablets that said certain people were entitled to certain bits and pieces. So we got to learn about the prosperity of Ugarit, but also we got to learn about their religious system. And they had a supreme god called El. El actually is simply a generic word for God. But as far as the Ugarits were concerned, there was a supreme El, but they didn't bother much with the supreme El because he was kind of benign. Instead, there was a god called Yam, and he had sovereignty over the sea, and was a mendacious god who was quite nasty. And there was another god called Baal. And Baal was a god of the land, he was god of nature, he was god of crops, he was god of fertility. And these two had a mega battle we read about in the Ugarit tablets, and Baal won that battle. And by this stage, Baal has a couple of horns on his head, and modern depictions of Baal show him like that, not least because one of the things that Baal demanded in return for fertility was child sacrifice. So we have a situation here where a very ancient culture, which is contemporary with the birth of Israel, and we have good uh, physical evidence of what they were up to and what they believed. The interesting thing about cuneiform, alphabetical cuneiform, is it's related very much so to Hebrew, ancient Hebrew. Here's a map of the area at the time. And if you look down, it's a French map, I think, Mer Noire, Mer Caspienne, but we're very European here. And if you look down to Gulf Pacifique, you will see a little place called Ur. And I hope Ur is ringing all sorts of bells in your mind. It should be, because Ur is where Abraham felt that El, the supreme God, was calling him to up sticks and head westward. And we have the birth of the Israelite nation. We then have Abraham's grandson Jacob, who had 12 sons, and they became the 12 tribes of Israel. And as we know, they ended up down in Egypt, firstly as guests, but latterly as slaves. And then God, El, the supreme God, delivers them from slavery miraculously, and they head out into the wilderness led by Moses. And the important thing about Moses is he is responsible for the nature of El, for El's wishes to be written down for the first time. So he goes up the mountain and comes down with the tablets, which has the law written on them. And then he goes on to produce the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, which is an expansion of the law to make it applicable to Israel as she enters the promised land. She enters the promised land, and as we've been learning in Judges, in our church sermons, they have an up and down kind of existence. They long for stability, they long for a king, and in the end they get King David, who demonstrates his credentials as a young man by killing the Philistine Goliath. So then we end up with Jerusalem. David captures Jerusalem, his son Solomon builds the palace, and this is Zion, this is God's place. The temple is where God lives, and it is the supreme God. He is the supreme God, and Israel has no time for all the other gods around them. The idea is they don't need to bother about those gods because there is one supreme God who has called them to be his people. Irrespective of the fact that they dally with the other gods, which brings about their downfall, the principle is that they should be a people worshipping the one God. As David is capturing Jerusalem and Solomon is setting up the monarchy there, if we head west, we end up in Greece. And Greece, there's a different sort of culture that's beginning to emerge. We know it begins with the writings, and we discover all about the Greek pantheon, the different gods that have strangely human characteristics, and they exercise authority in a number of different areas, and they fall out with each other and they battle with each other. But as Greece begins to develop, she develops a market system, the market towns, they become more sophisticated. And when you have markets and things like that, you have people who become wealthy. You then have people who can sit down and chew the cud rather than have to spend all their time working out where their next meal comes from. And so we have the development of Greek philosophy. We have Socrates, who's the original great Greek philosopher. Sadly, he wrote nothing down, but happily his pupil Plato did. And he wrote down a lot of what Socrates was saying. So where Socrates ends and Plato begins, we're not entirely sure. And then after Plato came the third of the great trio, Aristotle. And so we now have people across in Greece who are beginning to think beyond the pantheon. They're beginning to think about the deep questions of life, and they're trying to do that in the absence of if you like, a figure of a supreme God. Zeus is not the one they're looking for, and they're trying to work things out rationally. And Plato particularly is really important here because he, on the back of Socrates, suggests that there is another dimension to that which we exist in here. It's a perfect place. It's a place where nothing is material. It's all spiritual. It's all ethereal because it's perfect. it can't be material because material changes all the time, and anything that changes can't by definition be perfect, because perfect is a single condition. And so he argues that we're down here material, but in actual fact we're spirits trapped in a material body, and that explains an awful lot of our tension that we experience. The New Year's resolution tension, where we want to be better than we actually are. How do we know what better is? And why is it we can't be better? The answer is we know it's better because we are spirits living in a material world, and we can't be better because of this material world that traps us. There's a famous case of being in a cave and being able to see very dimly through the cave to something that is real, but we can't quite identify it precisely, and therefore we struggle with wanting to be perfect but not quite making it. And that then built on what was going on. So that became quite a powerful aspect of Greek thought. So you have the strongly monotheistic faith of the Israelites, and beside that you have this increasingly thoughtful philosophical approach of the Greeks. Two strong lines going forward, both with a lot to be said for them. And then we have what I would call the Christ event. And we have John the Apostle. I'm not entirely sure he looks like that. In fact, he looks quite sad there. So I do apologize for that particular illustration of him. But at the beginning of his gospel, he comes up with a genius phrase. In the beginning was the Word. Genius phrase, because for the Greeks, the perfect thing that out there, they called the Word, the Logos. And Logos was the perfect good. It was the supreme spiritual existence, a form. Difficult to put into words because it's not ethereal. But the word for the Greeks was the ultimate. For the Jews, God did things by the word. He spoke and creation came into being. He provided the Old Testament with the law, which is in the form of words. So the word was a demonstration of God's power. He spoke and mountains trembled. And what the Apostle John does with his opening is he's already immediately addressing the Jews and the Greeks by using the word, which is a concept that both the Greeks and the Jews understand, but they understand it in different ways. But then John does something completely revolutionary. And the word became flesh and dwelt among us. And for the Greeks, that's an absolute nonsense, because how can the supreme form, which is spiritual, possibly take on flesh? Because as soon as it did that, it would be imperfect. And for the Jews, it's a nonsense as well, because how can God become a man? How can God be down? God is the out there world power authority. So what John is saying is, I'm going to link into your two ideas, but I'm now going to ask you to leave those ideas behind and get in touch with something and someone that actually ultimately will be the answer to everything you could possibly hope to ask. And actually all those things you could never think of asking in the first place. The word became flesh and dwelt among us. And in a sense, the opportunity for a synthesis between the philosophical approach of the Greeks and the monotheistic approach of the Jews. Because you see, if you're a Jew, you were a Jew because God chose you. So how could a Greek become a Jew? Well, some Jews believed you could convert, but most didn't in those days. And so a lot of the Jews some of the Greeks were actually quite taken by the Jewish monotheistic faith, but they couldn't become Jews. But Jesus, if you like, opened the way for the Greeks to become God's chosen people through the gospel. Because it's one thing to say the word became flesh, that had to be demonstrated. And it was demonstrated through the empty tomb when Jesus rose from the dead, to demonstrate ultimately that, yes, he was indeed the Word, the Son of God. And upon that happening, we then have Peter, and he goes out and starts to preach the gospel, filled with the Holy Spirit. And I could go on into that at length, but I don't want to. I don't have time. I've got to keep with what I'm doing. There is something about this that is perfect timing, though. One of the Old Testament approach to history is this: history is not so much about facts. History is about learning about God and how God reveals himself through his deeds. And that, if you look at the history in the Old Testament, that's what's going on. And we look back in history and we see the Christ event happening at precisely the opportune time as human development, as human civilization is advancing. Because we have the Roman Empire, this monstrously huge empire, all controlled by Rome. If you stop and think about it, it's a remarkable achievement given their ability to communicate. But within the empire, there is relative peace, Pax Romana. Not only that, but there's a language that is uniting, in fact, Greek initially, but Latin to come, so people can talk to each other. It's a remarkable situation that's only just actually occurred. And the Roman Empire was at its greatest in AD 117. Again, that's just as the Christians are going out and preaching the gospel. And as we know, the Roman Empire itself was not a terribly nice place. In terms of all the statues that nowadays are being knocked down, I wonder if this place ought to be knocked down. Not only was Rome 40% slaves, but this was where they were gratuitously killed for the entertainment of others. We look at a wonderful building. Actually, it's a foul building, if you consider that. And Christianity was, if you like, emerging within that context. Not surprisingly, initially it was very popular with the slaves, but more and more Romans began to see and began to be called by God into his family, until ultimately Constantine in the 4th century, the early 300s, he's about to go into battle and he has this vision from Christ saying, I will be with you. And he puts the Chi, CH, on the front of his shield, Christ. And although outnumbered 2-1, he wins the battle. And so Rome becomes a Christian empire, formally at least. Happily at this time, there's this man called Benedict. And Benedict recognizes a lot of the corruption in the Roman Empire and says to a lot of Christians, we need to set up communities. We can't cope living in this place. We've got to be apart from this place. We can't be a part of this corrupt civilization. And so he sets up monasteries. Again, by the grace of God, this is ideal because a couple of hundred years later, Attila the Hun turns up. And they, with the Goths and all the other people, they charge into Rome. And Rome is now so divided and so not at one with itself that they can't resist Attila and his gang. Happily, we then move into the Dark Ages, where the Christian faith is, if you like, kept alive in those monastic communities. And then those monastic communities, as they spread out, are very evangelistic, and they bring that gospel back to the places where it had disappeared when Rome disappeared. And that's, I don't know which abbey that is, but it's a beautiful one. It's in ruins, but it was places like that where the monks who would set up a community outside a town, and they would offer all sorts of things to the community, including Christ. And so the Dark Ages became lighter. While this was happening, Islam was born in the Middle East, and by the 8th, 9th, 10th century, the Moors have moved into southern Spain. This is actually quite significant. You have to bear with me just a little bit for this, because they move into southern Spain, and we can see that that's the cathedral in Cordoba, which looks remarkably like a mosque, not least because it was a mosque. It's a very beautiful place. But the thing that the Muslims did was they brought with them Aristotle. And Aristotle, of the three Greek philosophers, was the one who wanted to study the world. He wanted to study things as they were. Plato was focusing on this perfect realm that lay beyond, whereas Aristotle said, let's make sense of where we are now. And whilst the Christian church had spurned Aristotle, the Muslims hadn't. And so Aristotle's influence enters into southern Spain. Just as a by the by, I'm glad it happened, because one of the things the Arabs brought us was the decimal numbering system. I wouldn't have fancied long division using Roman numerals. So thank you. Anyway, one of the things that came out of that was the Toledo School of Translators. That's Toledo Cathedral, again looking remarkably Moorish. And they started translating, amongst other things, Aristotle's works. And they then became available to Europe. And a guy called Thomas Aquinas began reading them. And Thomas Aquinas was responsible for all sorts of things, including this idea that the world itself is worth looking at. It's God's creation. It's a good place. And we get the Renaissance, the rebirth of classical influence. And that leads to the establishment of universities and schools, which are not just for the priests run by the church, but you can now study other things as well. And we can see the impact of this through art. So there's a 12th century picture of the Virgin Mary, and it's a depiction, it's a very stylized one. It's not a real person in that sense, and the baby looks remarkably adult. But as the Christians began thinking more seriously about creation as an aspect of God, after all, Thomas Aquinas said creation is evidence for God in terms of he made it. So the Virgin Mary became slightly different. And there's a depiction of her in the 16th century by Caravaggio. Some would say it becomes slightly disrespectful of her because she's got her breast down and she's about to feed the baby Jesus. But the church authorities liked it because that elevated Mary's status and showed that she was the one who fed the infant. Things came to a head when Caravaggio painted the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary. He was asked to do so, commissioned to do so, but was rejected because it was discovered that he used his prostitute mistress to model for Mary. So you see how the influence of the church at one level is bringing things to be more realistic, but as Europe becomes more and more confident in itself, so the imperative to be divinely respectful is beginning to wane somewhat. But on the backdrop of all this, of the Renaissance, we get the Reformation, because what's happening is that the Bible, which was restricted in terms of who had access to it, you only had access to the Latin version of it, and only the priests had access to that. So the common people didn't know what the Bible said. They couldn't read what the Bible said. They had to listen to the priest. But there was a double lock, as I say, because the translation that was used was the only one that was authorized by the church. But these people, John Wycliffe and William Tyndale, they're quite naughty because they decide to not only get hold of the Greek texts and translate the Greek texts themselves, but not into Latin, but into the local languages. The church tries to stop this. It tries to burn them. Well, it does burn them. But happily, they keep on going. And the newly produced printing presses, invented printing presses, are beginning to produce Bibles in the vernacular, in the language that anyone can understand. So we get Martin Luther, who then begins to break away from what he sees as the immorality of the Roman Catholic Church. You've got Zwingli, who's not so well known, but equally important in the Reformation. And then you've got John Calvin. These people are creating a real crisis in Europe, because what you're ending up with is not one, but two churches. And these two churches can't agree with each other. So who has got it right? Who has got it wrong? Both claim to have the authority of God, both claim to have the authority of the Bible, but they disagree so much that we end up with the European wars of religion that go on for several hundred years on and off. and they are extremely bloody, extremely nasty. Andrew, can't remember his surname now, has written a book on the Reformation, which actually tells you about it. And Fox's Book of Martyrs, if you want to see the pictures, here are some of them. There's a couple of ladies being burnt in Colchester. There's the rack being employed. And here is a little compendium of all the nasty things they did to people. They were massively creative of how they were going to kill people who happened to belong to the other church. So you can see that the church is now beginning to lose its credibility. Which church, what church, and also these things are being done in the name of God. Crumbs. This is bad news. But at the same time, science is beginning to develop. People are beginning to use their nous to look at the world around them, and they're beginning to come to conclusions that some people are unhappy with. Pierre de Bérulle is a French cardinal, and he's around in the 16th century. And at the beginning of the century, there is this thing going on in Paris, and this mathematician is saying we can get rid of all skepticism by using mathematical probability. In fact, mathematical probability we can apply to God as well. It's magnificent. And Pierre de Bérulle is uneasy about this, that people are going to start operating in this way. And at the end of this guy's lecture, everyone is clapping except a young mathematician called René Descartes. And so Pierre de Bérulle goes over to René Descartes and says, we need to deal with this situation, because we're going to be in danger if people think they can disprove God. And so he asked René Descartes to go away and pray and contemplate the proof for God. And René Descartes goes off to Holland, and he's there for 20 years. And at some time during that process, he has this approach that says, I'm going to doubt everything unless it can be shown to me beyond my doubt that it's the case. So he's systematically not going to accept anything that anyone else says, because he wants to get to the very heart of existence and God's existence. But as he begins to doubt everything, he even begins to doubt whether he exists. How do I know I exist? Well, I can communicate with other people, but how can I absolutely trust them and trust their reactions to me to be accurate? And how can I trust my senses? Because after all, sometimes I can feel things that are happening that are not actually there. And then he comes up with his famous statement, je pense donc je suis, or maybe he said it in Latin, cogito ergo sum, but he almost certainly did not say, I think, therefore I am. In other words, how could he think if he didn't exist to think in the first place? He had to exist, which was probably a great relief to him. And then he very rapidly established the existence of God. He knew the perfect existed, and he knew he was imperfect thereby. If he knew he was imperfect, therefore the perfect had to exist. He also knew he was he was finite. And if he knew he was finite, therefore the infinite had to exist. And so the perfect, infinite perfection was God. Brilliant. So God now exists. And if God exists, he's not going to allow us to be fooled by what's going on around us. He's going to give us the ability to trust the laws of nature as we see. And so therefore things began to slot into place. And at the end of this process, René Descartes is as enthusiastic a Christian as he was at the beginning. But he's done something that we, if we're not careful, overlook. Before René Descartes, in the beginning, God, and God made me. René Descartes says, in the beginning, me. Now, does God exist? Leslie Newbigin, a 20th century philosopher, says, we believe in order to know. We believe in order to know. René Descartes believes in himself in order to know that God exists. So it's his belief that allows God to be in place. Whereas before that, belief started with God. I believe in God. Now, how do I make sense of everything around me? And this is absolutely crucial, though at the time it's not that obvious, because he's followed by a Christian called Isaac Newton. And Isaac Newton brilliantly is able to quantify how nature works. An apple, well, we think an apple falls on it. Anyway, something like that happens. And he recreates that in a laboratory, and he comes up with gravity and all sorts of laws of science, which I seem to remember learning in basic form when I was about 14 at school. This was brilliant, because this now made sense of a world that could be predicted, God's world. Isaac Newton was a great believer in God. He was a Christian. He wasn't an atheist. And an English philosopher called John Locke said, yeah, and what he's doing, he's looking at two types of knowledge. We have the knowledge that we can work out through our senses, and then we have the knowledge that we then make sense of as we reason on it. So we bring information in, and then we process it, almost like our brain is a processor, and we process the knowledge that comes in order to produce reflections. And it's a very close link between the two. And then came a Scottish guy called David Hume. David Hume actually undermined the link that John Locke was making between senses and reflections. And David Hume, if you like, gave birth to something called skepticism. And David Hume challenged the idea that just because something has happened like that in the past, how do we know it's going to happen like that in the future? The classic example of that I might give is you're tossing a coin. I used to do this with the kids at school. I'm going to toss a coin. We've never tossed this coin before, I'd say. And I'm going to toss it to see what it comes down as. So I'd toss it. It came down tails. Tails, I'd say. I'd toss it again. It's tails again. And I'd do that about 8 or 9 times, and each time saying tails. By this time, the kids are looking at me because they know I'm telling porky pies. And by about 9 or 10, I admit I'm telling porky pies. And so I did once get to 6 consecutively. But I asked them to accept the logic that I could toss that coin 1,000 times and it could come down 1,000 times tails. Unlikely, but possible. If you do an experiment in the laboratory and it comes down tails 1,000 times, you would be reasonably justified in saying, I have proven this coin always comes down tails. But on the 1,001st occasion, it might come down heads. And you don't know that's not going to be the case. That's basically what David Hume was saying about anything and everything. And he says that reason, this ability to link our experiences to being able to make sense of what's going to happen, this build of reason simply doesn't exist. You can't rely on it. We can be fooled into relying on it, but it just cannot be. Interestingly enough, Einstein's theory of relativity kind of caught up with that. And I was told by some physics graduates who had studied quantum physics that it is entirely possible for me to step out of my front door onto the surface of the sun and live there for 10 minutes. Highly unlikely, but scientifically possible. So all these things begin to unravel, even as reason is beginning to be seen as the answer to all our problems. But God himself is now in serious trouble. And Pierre-Simon Laplace, a French mathematician, had written for Napoleon an account of how things came to be. And Napoleon had questioned him and said, you haven't mentioned God yet. And Pierre-Simon Laplace said, Je n'avais pas besoin de cette hypothèse-là. I no longer have need of that hypothesis. Pierre-Simon Laplace no longer needed God. On this side of the channel, William Paley, at the end of the 18th century, he was the Archdeacon of Carlisle, I gather. He went to Giggleswick School, where my brother went to. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. He wrote a book called Natural Theology, Existence and Attributes of the Deity. Building on what Descartes had done, William Paley now proved scientifically that God existed. There was no doubt about it. You could read his book and be convicted. And you couldn't go to Oxford University if you hadn't read it. There you go. Just 60 or 70 years later, along comes a guy called Charles Darwin. And Charles Darwin offers this explanation of how things can be as they are without any designer. William Paley had talked about watches and how wonderfully designed watches were and how everyone would have to look at a watch and say, someone made this. Same with nature. And Charles Darwin just said, it need not be like that. It could be completely different. And suddenly, those who didn't want the existence of God had scientific rationale for explaining how things were so beautifully designed without having to resort to God. And this idea of the God of the gaps came into being. We have gaps in our knowledge, and if we can't understand it, then God did that. But the more we close those gaps, the less we need God. And Charles Darwin closed a very important door. So if you have no God, how are you going to decide what is right and what is wrong? It's dead easy when Jesus says, love your neighbor and love me. And the Old Testament 10 Commandments says, don't commit adultery or whatever. But if you've got no God, how are you going to decide how to live? On this side of the channel, Jeremy Bentham set up something called utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is the principle that holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness and wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. And that was it. Here was a way now that we were going to decide what was right and what was wrong without reference to God, just using our minds and our experiences and working things out. That's how he looked then. This is how he looks now, because he bequeathed his body to University College London. They pickled it and his head is on display and you can still see it. I think they've given him a new set of eyes, but yes, still got his hair there. And on the back of that, we have the development of what is called secular humanism. They call it humanism. I might come back to that later. Secular humanism. So you have the Humanist UK, and they think for yourself, act for everyone. It's all very about me, but me working for everyone. Bringing non-religious people together to develop their own views. We don't need God to do it for us. We're now mature and we can develop our understanding of the world together and we can get on with it. We're people who live and shape our own lives. We do it. We don't need God to do it. We're big enough and clever enough to do it. We make sense of the world through logic, through reason, through evidence. We always seek to treat those around us with warmth, understanding, and respect. And it's quite clear that they have this notion that if only everyone could be persuaded to look in this way, wouldn't the world be a wonderful place? Here's Lucy Porter. Human beings aren't as bad and terrible and wicked as I was taught to believe. Maybe we don't need a God. Maybe we're just good people. I was listening to an interview with Jonathan Sacks, the retired chief rabbi, Lord Sacks, and he was talking about his experience of going to Auschwitz. And this is what he said. He wrote, "After the Holocaust, I feel I must believe in God because I simply can't believe in humanity. The Holocaust did not take place in some medieval century. The Holocaust did not take place in some benighted third world country. It took place at the very heart of Europe. It took place in the Germany of Goethe, of Schiller, of Kant and Hegel and Bach and Beethoven. It took place in a country that held itself to be the most civilized in the world, in a century that was held to be the most exalted in the world. I don't know anyone who can have faith in humanity after that." He acknowledged that people might lose their faith going to Auschwitz, but for him, how can anyone have faith in human beings after seeing what those human beings were capable of achieving? That doesn't necessarily mean, though, that the Humanist Association are chasing things that are wrong. Reason, decency, tolerance, empathy, and hope, human traits that we should aspire to, not because we seek reward of eternal life, good gracious me, no, or because we fear the punishment of a supernatural being, but because they define our humanity. Where do they get their notion of humanity from? They don't get it from Japanese culture. They don't get it from Indian culture. They don't get it from Maori culture. They get it from the Bible. That's where they get it from. Very important to remember that. And the United Nations, in my book, is the great achievement of humanism. The idea that we can now export our humanist values to all the nations in the world. And we will go out and we will send soldiers out to maintain peace. We will send UNICEF out to look after children. We will coordinate aid packages. And we will also begin to interfere with your cultural way of life as well, because we think the way we do things in the West is the best way. And so we will begin to have an influence on that as well. And we will encourage your people to have abortions, because we think that's a really good way of controlling birth control, and controlling populations. And we will begin to break up some of the family situations if we feel that that is bad to what we understand to be good ways of living. So United Nations are giving a lot of aid to everyone, and that's a very, very good thing. But they also impose Western cultural values on the nations, or they expect them to accept the Western values. So, for instance, all states have to listen to children. Why do all states have to listen to children? Does that mean children can begin to does that mean children ought to have votes? Some people think that children ought to have votes. My understanding is that all states should listen to children's parents, and parents should have a responsibility for bringing up their children and teaching their children rather than the state doing. Anyway, that's a side by side. One of the things that comes out of this, though, is that the United Nations begin to pontificate about rules. So here's Ban Ki-moon. This is one thing he said some time ago. When so-called surgical strikes end up hitting surgical wards, something is deeply wrong. And I heard that quoted at a conference, and I interjected. And I said, when so-called surgical strikes end up hitting surgical wards, someone thinks it's right. And the person said, well, it's wrong. I said, why is it wrong? Because the United Nations say it's wrong. I know, but if someone says it's right, why should the United Nations be right and the other person be wrong? Well, because the United Nations says it's right, she said. And we left it at that. Interestingly enough, this had legal support from the United Nations. On the 29th of April in 1999, Allies bombed the television headquarters in Belgrade and killed 16 employees on the night shift. They just worked in a television studio. And some lawyer said to NATO forces acting with the approval of the United Nations that that was a legitimate target, and they killed 16 people. I have a friend who's now a school chaplain. He was going to be an RAF pilot. He'd got through all the initial selection phases. He was due to go to Cranwell, and then this happened. And he said, I can't be a pilot because I wouldn't be prepared to do that. It's a funny business, this legal system, isn't it? Some things you can do and some things you can't. What's gone wrong? Os Guinness is a Chinese-born British philosopher living and working in America. And he has this understanding of how our culture has always survived. Basically, we have this thing called freedom. We are free as individuals. But freedom needs virtue. People have to behave virtuously for freedom to be viable. If people don't behave virtuously, then freedom is going to be curtailed because people will be forced to work in a different way. But for people to have virtue, they need to have faith. They need to believe in something that enables them to behave in a virtuous way. It's really important. And for there to be faith, you need freedom. You need freedom to believe. So he sees a triangle there, which is absolutely fundamental to any culture if it's going to operate in an appropriate way, in a Christian way. And what he says is, we've taken faith away. And when you take faith away, the culture begins to collapse, not at first in an obvious way. He calls it cut flower culture. If you cut the flowers from their roots, for a while they will blossom, but eventually they will wither and die. Because although we have the ability to work things out, at the end of the day, we don't have the foundation to, if you like, establish our workings on. Here's another humanist, Stephen Hawking. He said there is a fundamental difference between religion, which is based on authority, and science, which is based on observation and reason. Science will win because it works. I have a problem there because science is about observing things. Reason is how we work things out. So let me give you an example of how science is not cut and dried. This guy is called Francis Crick. Francis Crick was part of the team that unraveled the human genome. He was the one who looked at human, found the human DNA, and he began the process of unraveling it. Francis Crick said, technically, I'm an agnostic because I can't disprove God in the laboratory, but I'm an atheist. And he withdrew, he resigned his fellowship at Churchill College, Cambridge, when Churchill College was given money to build a chapel and decided to go ahead and do it. Francis Crick believed that religion had no place in an academic establishment. Full stop, end of argument. This is a guy called Francis Collins. Two Francises. Francis Collins was an atheist, went to university, he was a scientist, ended up becoming a doctor. And when he was 29, he was working with patients who were dying of cancer. And he used to spend a lot of time talking to them and asking them and helping them through and asking them what they believed in things. And one day, a woman who was dying of cancer said, Francis, what do you believe? And he'd never really thought about it before in a serious way. And one of the things he did was he went away and read C.S. Lewis's book, Christianity, Meg knows it, Christianity, I know, anyway, it doesn't matter.
Mere Christianity.
Mere Christianity, yes, mere Christianity. Thank you, Meg. As a result of that and other things, he became a Christian. He actually went on to lead the world team that finally unraveled and mapped out the human DNA. So he was working on exactly the same science as Francis Crick, but working on it as someone who was unraveling unbelievable mystery that could only have been created by God. One science, two people, two different conclusions. Science will win. Well, it depends on who's interpreting that particular bit of science. And that becomes really important. Science cannot and will not ever be able to help us unravel the rights and wrongs of this world. Nevertheless, we're trying to do it, and we're trying to do it without God. And if any of you are in any public organization, you'll have come across those three words in close formation: diversity and inclusion. And this is a most laudable objective of getting us to accept each other in a very Christian manner, to love each other as we love ourselves. And diversity and inclusion people have worked out that there are certain groups of people who have suffered at the other hands of the majority, if you like. So they talk about ethnicity and race. They talk about religion. They talk about sex. They talk about sexuality. They talk about age. They talk about disability. And more recently, they talk about gender. And these are all things that define people, and we need to accept people irrespective of these aspects that might or might not define them. And most public bodies, in fact, all public bodies have this, they employ people in order to educate their employees along these lines. They want to get rid of all these things, all this prejudice and discrimination. They want to rid themselves of it. And this is absolutely how it should be. So we're trying to persuade people to operate like this. Not everyone goes for it. You can't persuade everyone. Some people will not be persuaded. So we're now focusing on hate. We don't want people to hate. And so in the Scottish government, we're very keen on stopping people hating other people. Again, I used to teach kids at school, and I used to say, prejudice is simply prejudging a situation. And prejudging a situation is really quite an intelligent thing to do in many cases, because if a teacher comes into a classroom, you prejudge the teacher and treat them in a certain way, which is a useful thing to do. So prejudice will lead to discrimination. The challenge, though, is to let your prejudice be effectively challenged by your experiences. And too many of us don't allow our prejudice to be challenged, and therefore we indulge in damaging discriminatory practices. We all discriminate all the time, for goodness sake. But sometimes it's damaging and we have not to do it. But I always said to the kids, all that the law can do is stop you behaving in hateful ways. It can't stop you hating. How can a law stop you hating? It can only stop you behaving in hateful ways. But now the Scottish government has on its books the Hate Crime and Public Order Scotland Bill. And they're going to go for people who hate, and they're going to go for people, if they have good reason to believe that in your house you have material that could promote hateful actions, then they can get a warrant to search your house, and the maximum sentence is 7 years. There's been a lot of pushback on this, and it's not yet got through. And a lot of people, in myself included, hope it won't get through. But it's very interesting, isn't it? Very interesting how they're beginning to, some people are trying to begin to control the way we think. Not just what we do, but the way we think. Because their idea that we can all be persuaded to think the same way, if only we get taught the right things and use our minds in a human, rational way, the idea that we'll all come to the same conclusions hasn't worked. It can never work. So now they're trying to control how we think. And at the heart of this is this problem that humanism set us with. They said, science will set us free. Science will explain everything. And some people still think it will. They still talk about neuroscience being able to explain consciousness. You read some of the stuff, it's barking. Well, in my view, but then it's just my view. It's my reason operating. And why should my reason be any worse than any other person's reason? So science will set us free to be autonomous, to be ourselves. The problem is science is a closed system. Science is a closed system as cause and effect. And autonomy is all about being able to do what you want. And so there's always going to be a clash between them, which we hadn't seen. And up to now, the science side, the rational side had held sway. But now the autonomous side is holding sway. And people increasingly be able to make claims that are absolutely unscientific, and yet, if you like, be supported in those claims. One other thing I want to say. In this country, this Enlightenment process ended up with humanism, or secular humanism, as I would like to call it, a way of approaching good and bad without God that very much reflected Christian values. On the continent, there were two key movers in the atheist mode. There was Friedrich Nietzsche and Karl Marx. Friedrich Nietzsche had a fat go at British humanists. Friedrich Nietzsche said he couldn't work out why in Britain they get rid of God, but then for some reason cling on to Christian morality, which he said is simply not instinctive. Christian morality is not instinctive, so why do they insist on clinging to it? And Friedrich Nietzsche came up with this notion of Übermensch. Based on evolution by natural selection, he said, at the end of the day, you've got to make your own mind up. You've got to make your own principles up, and you've got to go for it. And if you end up being stronger than someone else, let the devil take the hindmost, if the devil exists. Of course, he doesn't. But devil take the hindmost. And that's how evolution has always operated. That's how it always will operate. The Übermensch will rise to the top simply by taking control and not listening to daft ideas about Christianity and all that sort of stuff. There was a man called Adolf Hitler who very much took to what Nietzsche said. And although the Nazis very doctored Nietzsche's work in order to make it suit them perfectly, nevertheless, Hitler said, although what we do is very unpleasant, Europe will thank us down the centuries because we'll have got rid of the Jews for them. A very unpleasant process, but they will be grateful to us because we've done it on their behalf. Karl Marx, on the other hand, interestingly enough, ended up in London. And he decided, unlike Hitler, he decided that the future was everyone sharing everything in common, everyone getting together and having no private property. If everything is shared, then everyone's going to be happy and no one's going to be unhappy, and it's going to be absolutely wonderful. And Lenin thought that was a cracking idea, and Stalin thought that was a cracking idea as well. Chairman Mao did. And President Xi as well. They all think it's great that we can force these things on people. And if they don't like it, well, we'll just kill them. But don't worry about it. At the end of the day, everyone will be more than happy. The reason I show you these two examples is because the foundation that these two now discredited, but one of them still clinging to life by attaching a bit of capitalism to itself. The reason that they're doing it is because these two are built on the same atheistic foundations as humanism. In England, it went in a different direction. It took the Christian route. But I would argue that if you went to communist Russia 30, 40 years ago and you said something that was critical of the communist regime, you'd be heading eastwards to a very chilly place where you'd spend a long time. Now, I'm not saying that by any stretch of the imagination we're heading in that direction in degree. The fact that the police a year ago rang up an ex-copper who had tweeted a limerick that was deemed by one person to be transphobic. She reported it to the police, and the Humberside police rang him up. And although they admitted that he hadn't committed a crime, he was told to watch his thinking. I hope, is that depressing? I don't know if it's depressing or not. I hope it's not too depressing, because I do actually think that the gospel has a way forward, and I think we have that which the nation needs. I'm going to leave you with this last slide because this guy is an absolute genius. He's dead. And this book he wrote and published in 1995 is, if you read it, you'll find that some of what you've just heard unashamedly comes initially from him and his thinking. That is such a good book. It's a short book. It's not long. I've read it 1.5 times now. It will be read probably 2 or 3 more times. I sent a copy to my daughter in Birmingham. She's read it and she's started it a second time. It's not a ladybird book, but it's not a doctorate thesis. But it's very engaging and very, very insightful. So that's it. Gosh, an hour. I do apologize.
Well, thank you so much indeed, Robert. I think that's probably the quickest overview of quite a number of thousands of years in the human thought. So in an hour, I thought that was a massive achievement. And I would, if I wasn't so jealous, give you a round of applause. But anyway, well done. What I would say is, guys, it's open to you now to ask any questions of Robert. If you keep yourselves muted, but when you want to ask a